Back in my 20s, for a short period of time, I worked as a security guard for a men's homeless shelter. I needed a job that fit my schedule and allowed me to box, and this was a job that did that as it was overnights, so it worked. And it was easy enough. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays were my shift, and it was pretty straightforward. A social worker of sorts would process each homeless man in, and my job was to inspect their bags for drugs, alcohol, or weapons. I scanned the bags and the people with a metal rod and made sure they weren't too high or too intoxicated. You couldn't keep them from doing any drugs, but just tried to make sure they didn't come in all messed up. Now, like all security jobs, I wasn't supposed to actually intervene if things got out of hand physically. I just had to call the police and try to keep the situation under control until they got there. Now, this was for the most part the easiest job I've ever had or would ever do. However, it did have its moments, which included getting scabies from taking a nap on one of the never washed mats that the homeless people slept on when there was an overflow. See, at the homeless shelter, there's a quota for how many people can come in, and on certain events or certain, weather situations, we can go over that limit. Like in Pittsburgh, where I live, if it was below 25 degrees Fahrenheit, we could bring in more than the cots had capacity for. And when that happened, they slept on these mats. Well, I decided to sleep on a few mats when I realized I could get away with sleeping. We weren't allowed to. And I paid for that with a vicious scabies infection. I didn't have health insurance, so I had to figure out an ad hoc way to take care of this, which if you ever have scabies, the cure is to soak in a really hot bathtub in a water full of bleach. What did I put in there? Bleach, tea tree oil, and something else. Oh, alcohol, rubbing alcohol, and it'll kill them as long as just make sure you don't get that shit in your eyes. Anyhow, other events from the homeless shelter got my life threatened several times trying to break up fights. I ended up dealing with the police more in 6 months than I did in my entire life. And I'm from the projects where you always have to deal with the police, whether you're calling them or giving your account of things, and that's assuming you talk to the police and they're not badgering you, those kind of things. And I even had someone break into my old busted up car. I don't know what they took from it, but it was broken. I could tell from the handle, and I think they were just mad at me or something. But this job, it didn't really teach me anything new about human nature, man, because I'm from around the block and I've seen some things and I know how nasty people can be. But I did learn a few things about homeless people and myself. Now, I'm warning you, prepare to have most of what you've been told about the homeless population challenged. I'm not saying that my perspective is the most accurate, and it's definitely not the only one. But between this job and a volunteer assignment I did at another homeless shelter when I was completing my degree, I've seen the belly of the beast. And I'm telling you, it's not what society wants you to think. With that said, let's hop into 5 things that I learned about the homeless people and the homeless situation while I was working at this men's homeless shelter. There's this prevailing myth that most homeless people are military vets or they suffer from mental illness. This is simply not true. I watched about 500 different homeless men get processed over my 6 months there, and I'm not sure how many had prior military service, but I only remember one who had mental illness to the point where someone should have been taking care of him. Most of the guys who were there are guys who had done 5 to 10 years plus in prison, and their friends and family moved on. And since they were convicted felons, the criminal justice system makes it virtually impossible for them to get work. They had simply run out of options to make money and did not have a support system. Now, side note before I continue, if you're one of these guys or know someone like this, the article I based this video on is linked in the description. In that article, someone reached out to me and had me include a great resource to help guys who are in this situation. If that's you or you know someone like that, I strongly recommend you check it out. Now, continue. This is a difficult situation for people who have never been incarcerated or know someone who's been incarcerated to imagine. While there are resources in prison to better yourself, imagine how difficult it can be to do that in an environment with other killers, murderers, and rapists and things like that. Sure, there are the exceptions people who make it out and have a great go, and prison is behind them. They serve their debt to society. But for the most part, what happens to those people in jail who try to better themselves is exactly what you'd expect, and it's even worse when they get out. I talk more about the things men can do to avoid ruining their life in this manner in the 3 worst things men can do to ruin their lives video. I linked to that in the pinned comment. I definitely recommend you check that out because going to jail is one of those things that you can do that ruins your life for the remainder of it. Uh, if you avoid going to prison, your life is going to mostly be all right. Now, it might not be spectacular, but you'll always be in a position to improve your circumstances. Of course, you have to consider what type of person you're actually dealing with when you talk about people who get jail time of this nature, the double digit numbers where their family just moves on. Now, once we get past all the guys who haven't been to jail and don't have a place to live as a result of it, here's a question I want you to think about. Imagine that you suddenly lost your place to live. What would you do? If you're like most people, your basic plan would consist of finding a new place to live and in the meantime staying with a friend or relative. Well, if you're like many of the guys at the homeless shelter, you won't be able to get a new place when they run a background check because of your prison record. And even if you can get a new place, it's going to be extremely difficult to get a job and pay rent because of your prison record. So naturally, you just stay with friends or relatives until you figure it out. Except for some guys in the homeless shelter. They can't because their friends and relatives have deserted them. In more than a few intake interviews, I heard friends and family had deserted these guys after many failed promises and multiple imprisonments. We'd all like to believe that those we care for will be there for us through thick and thin, but everyone has a breaking point. Clearly, the families of these men had reached theirs and were willing to let them live on the street. I also witnessed a few tragic scenes at the homeless shelter. I saw more than one guy who got laid off a few weeks earlier. He couldn't make the rent, had no savings, and so they evicted him. Reality is both fair and cruel in this way. This is one of those experiences that are far better to learn vicariously. You don't need to learn everything the hard way. You won't survive long enough to reap the benefits of the lessons you learn if you do. There are several stats about how most Americans don't have anything saved. Some people doubt that the majority of Americans have less than $1,000 saved, but I've seen this happen at the homeless shelter and in my personal life way too many times to doubt it. And even if a person has $10,000 saved, how long would that last in a place like San Francisco, New York, DC, or any of those expensive cities around this country? The article this essay is based on is linked in the description, so you can check out those stats if you want to, because I included them there. Now, I'm inclined to believe that those stats are completely true. If you don't have anything saved up, you need to work on building your value and income streams because being homeless is no way to live. Now, many of the guys at the homeless shelter weren't technically homeless. I personally often cut up on minimalism because I believe it's most people justifying a lack of ambition or grit. While I'm a firm believer that everyone should be happy with what they have, minimalists often highlight their lack of modern convenience as a mark of superiority, rather than just saying they don't make enough or aren't ambitious enough to earn more, so they make their lifestyle or lack of it seem preferable. Now, this is most people. I met 2 different truckers at the homeless shelter who decided to stay there because it was simply more sensible to do this than rent an apartment. These were guys in their 50s, never married, and didn't have any kids. That gives you an idea of the kind of life you need to do this, but it's not a bad idea from a pure financial perspective if you're constantly on the road. Whichever city they were in, they just found homeless shelters and tried to get there first for the night. Because the way a homeless shelter works, at least the ones I worked in, is that there was, again, a certain amount of people they could let in. You had to be there in line to wait. Now, some fights sometimes broke out as guys tried to cut in front of guys and get ahead, but you had to be there. And if there was a cutoff point, sorry, man, you're out of luck. Okay. So these guys will try to be first in line. I guess they had some type of app or whatever it is to let them know where all the homeless shelters are. That is me being silly. It might exist, but I think it would be kind of funny if there was an app to show homeless people where the homeless shelters are. But then again, smartphones now are like everyone has them. So there's that. But, consider this, man. Truckers make decent money. That's certainly enough to not need this. It ain't the path I would take, but I understand it. To me, this was a true minimalist lifestyle and is something that has always stuck with me. In this same vein, I met two 18-year-old kids that were in a homeless shelter for about 3 weeks while I was there. I got to know them and learn their story. They weren't thrown out of their house or anything. They were from small backwoods towns in West Virginia with zero opportunity. They decided to leave and figure out how to make it work up here in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's probably, depending on what part of West Virginia you want to go to, either 45 minutes away or up to 5 hours. That's kind of the span of the whole state. Um, and in 3 weeks while they were in the shelter, they went from having nothing to getting jobs and being enrolled at community college and getting an apartment together. Now, most people would have waited and made excuses for their life, but not these two dudes. They took their life into their own hands and made it work for them. If they had that type of grit and courage at 18, I'm sure they're doing all right now. It's been about, what am I, 39? So it's like, man, it's been a little while ago. It's like, this is about 15 years. So I'm sure they're doing okay. Now, if you want to avoid this type of situation for yourself, you need to take on some real self-improvement by following the suggestions in this video right here. As always, the rest is up to you.